Hello and welcome to the first of a special series of episodes on a special series of episodes on the Tigers Down Under. It's a chance to look back at the 2010s and whole city's trials and tribulations through that decade and all the good things that came along the way as well. And with me on the first episode, I have Brad. How are you, Brad?
Good, thanks, mate. How you going?
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, it's an exciting sort of new twist on our series of podcasts. Normally we'll review and preview games each week, but this is sort of a little bit different. So it's going to be a bit of fun to try out. It'll go up sort of exclusively for the Patreons for about a week, I would say, and then we'll release it to everyone else. But it's just a little something for the patrons and sort of an encouragement for people that want to sign up. But we'll get underway. So we sort of wanted to, or where we can, where we have City shirts that correlate to the season in question, we'll sort of talk about the shirts that we have that tie into that. And so for the first episode, I thought I would chat about Tom Cairney first of all. Shirt that I'm wearing has got Cairney's name on the back. He was sort of there was a lot of players to like in that side in that first sort of Premier League spell. So you know, Myhill, Giovanni, Windass, of course, as irrepressible and difficult to argue with. Ashby, you know, as you've got in your avatar there, and other players like that. But Cairney for me was, you know, he was one of the young players who broke into the team. There was a few of them at the time. Cooper was another one, of course, who's now playing at Leeds in the Premier League, but and Cairney, of course, as well, with Fulham scoring a great goal last night. But he was sort of one that I latched onto in those early days, and he was still with us when we returned to the Championship in 2010-11. So what are your memories of Cairney in that spell, Brad?
Well, look, I remember the goal at Everton was like, I think it gave us something to be pretty proud of, that one of our own young players had got to the big stage and really scored. And he actually looked like he just belonged in that lineup for a guy who was always trying to sort of break his way in. But like most things, things got tough, not just for him, but for the whole team. And obviously, the fact he's had such a long career at Fulham and ended up being captain and getting him promoted and all that shows how good he was. But he certainly was a talent. And I still remember there was people raving about how good a young player he was, even though they'd only watched that one game.
Yeah, exactly. So no, it was definitely an exciting one in the side, and I guess we'll start to talk about the kind of the context or the beginning of that 2010-11 season and how difficult a time it was for the club. Falling out of the Premier League, there were a few different financial issues, a few ownership issues, which we'll probably touch on in the next episode. We'll touch on the takeover by the Allams, but for this episode, I guess it was all about finding a bit of stability. Following the sort of Bartlett, Pearson regime, I guess you would say. Pearson obviously was still there. I think he'd essentially taken over the running of the club, is my memory of it. And I guess his big move for the start of this season was appointing Nigel Pearson as manager, which from memory at the time was a reasonably surprising acquisition. He was a pretty successful manager at Leicester from memory at that point. And we then basically approached them and they gave us permission to speak to him. And of course, later on down the track, he went back to Leicester. But I think from memory at the time, he always sort of said the fact that Leicester allowed him to speak to us was part of the reason he was so happy to come along and sign up with us, because he was a bit affronted that they would let that happen.
Yeah, something strange was going on. I remember there was a lot of Leicester fans upset that he left. At the stage that he left Leicester, I think his career at Leicester was obviously pretty solid as a manager, because I remember thinking, why would he want to come to us at that point, unless there was something we didn't know? So at that time, obviously, we'd been relegated. We'd had the heyday of being a Premier League club. I suppose him getting signed really gave us some hope at the time, or gave me some hope at the time, that we thought we were going to bounce straight back.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a very no nonsense sort of manager, which is exactly what you want when you've suffered that relegation to the championship. He basically took on a club where he almost had to completely rebuild the team, and I think I remember him saying quite early on that he approached it as sort of a progression where he started with fixing the defence. So he was sort of renowned for his dour 1-0 results, but I think that was in part because there was such a focus on we're a team that ships a lot of goals. We'll talk in a little bit when we look at some of the key games from that first half of the season, at some of the big losses that we had. And he obviously focused on bringing some defenders into the club as well. So defensively sound manager and gave us back probably a bit of strength in defence that we needed. From memory, I think we went on a pretty long run of an undefeated streak of home games as well that season. So brought a bit of home form back for the club, which is what you need. We're sort of seeing it again this season with the need when you have that relegation to sort of reshape the club and reshape the focus of the players. And he did that reasonably well at the start of that season.
Yeah, and I think probably as fans, we all knew how obviously well regarded he was as a manager, and probably with the fast that was that end of that relegation year, I think it was probably a really strong move, but also probably helped even retain some of those players we thought we might lose. But more importantly, probably helped the fact that Pearson he always came across as sort of a little bit aggro, and the fact he could probably get in there and sort out a few of these wage bill type player legacy issues that we were going to have by not playing and being quite firm with them probably was a pretty strong advantage at that time as well.
Yeah, and so you touched on there some of the player departures that we had, and probably the most heartbreaking one was Boaz Myhill. And I'm still forever frustrated at the fact that after having been such a great keeper for us for a number of years, he essentially left us for, I think it was about £1.5 million to sit on West Brom's bench for the next 6 or 7 years, which I think it was. So, amongst the departures, so you had Myhill departing for West Brom, Giovanni left for San Jose, which at the time was, I guess a move to the MLS was not, it's still not considered a fantastic move these days, but to leave a relegated Premier League club for the MLS was probably a bit of a disappointing one. We had Olofinjana got loaned out to Cardiff. Anthony Gardner went to Palace. Kuzan left on a free as well, which was disappointing. And I think sort of the common trend with a lot of these departures was the fact that we either came to a mutual agreement to terminate their contract or release them on a free deal. There weren't a whole lot of transfer fees coming into the club. And I think Myhill, the one pictured here, was probably the only one really that brought in a transfer fee. So given the fact that the club was in a financial mess at the time, this likely didn't help things, but I suspect there was probably a reason why, as you mentioned earlier, just getting these wages off the books was pretty paramount at the time.
Yeah, look, I think Myhill's probably an interesting one because I think, well, other than you and I, there was probably a lot of fans putting rumours out there about how we were going to loan him back. At one stage, I remember that came up, but I think he probably believed he was a Premier League keeper. And we don't know. Obviously the club, like you just went through some of those names, to give up those players for free or loan out the way we did was probably what we now know was just a wage bill that was ginormous. And we all know that Myhill was a Premier League keeper. We saw when he was in the Premier League how good he was. We go back to those saves against Arsenal and even the playoff semis against Watford. He was world class when he was running hot. So I think, like you said, though, $1.5 million is just chicken feed for a great keeper.
And I guess the other one who I haven't even mentioned there was Stephen Hunt as well. I think went to Wolves, and he might have gone for a fee as well. I think it was. I remember they were after him in the January of our relegation season for about $5 million or so, which at the time was a pretty reasonable fee. And then I think he broke his foot, or he had some sort of injury, which basically halved that fee that we ended up receiving for him. So he was another one, I guess, who. It's interesting because you look at the impact Giovanni had in that first season, where I think he scored 8 goals for the season from 33 or 34 games. But in that second season, only got the 3 goals, played 25, 26 games, I think it was, for the season. So there was a pretty reduced output from him, which you could probably argue is part of the reason that we went down. So whilst you look at those names as big departures, perhaps in terms of impact on the team, they weren't as significant as they had been previously.
Yeah, look, you're probably right. I think, that second half of that season, there was clearly, I think anyway, the results obviously weren't there, we know that. But clearly around that Christmas break, about the time Brownie would have felt like this is all going to come to an end pretty quickly. You can imagine what was going on in that January transfer window with us being, towards the bottom with the wage bill we've got and the owners and football directors, let's call them, running around covering their backsides. It wouldn't surprise me if they probably shopped every player on our books out at that time. And who knows, mate, that sort of stuff probably went through the club news pretty quick, or the players through their agents would have heard things. And it definitely was the most unsettled, well, before the obviously recent times, it was the most unsettled we'd seen the club, full stop, I think. There was a bit going on. We all felt there was something going on, but we didn't really know.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely symbolised by Myhill leaving. I mean, obviously Andy Dawson was still at the club, so, and Ashby as well. So we still had that sort of connection to the team that had brought us through the divisions. But Myhill was sort of after, France might have left around the same time, I think. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Myhill was sort of chipping away at that core that had come through the divisions for us. On the other side of things, we did see a few players that would go on to become city legends in their own right join the club, and it was funny actually at the end of the last episode that Dan and I were recording on Wednesday. We did have a comment about Josh Emmanuel being one of the best free transfers we've done, and we'll probably talk on the next episode about best ever free signings or best free signings in this era. And I think the two players pictured here, Robbie Corrin and Liam
I was
Rosenia,
waiting for it.
are probably two of the best that we've managed to bring through the doors. And you sort of think, considering they were free transfers and considering the state that the club was in at the time, to be able to bring in players like this, who probably. They were probably expected to do reasonably well, but probably did exceeded expectations and then some with the efforts that we got from them, and really turned out to be diamonds in the rough, just to a large extent. I mean, in saying that, Corrin was a Premier League midfielder. It wasn't as if we plucked him from obscurity, but both were fantastic signings for us in that period.
Yeah, they were, and you wouldn't really want to try and compare who got the best value out of it, but they were both amazing signings considering where they joined us as a newly relegated team. But clearly, I think Corrin was there from the start of the season, I think, because Pearson brought him in.
He was. So Corrin joined in August, I believe, and we'll go on and talk about the games in a second, but that Millwall 4-0 defeat was Corrin's debut, which I think was the second game of the season. So yeah, he was essentially there from the start. And then Rosenia joined back then. Well, I guess they were free agents anyway. So Rosenia joined in October, but back then, of course, there was the short-term loans and that sort of thing. So we were bringing players in all through that first 6 months of the season, really.
Yeah, and I think Corrin came with that pedigree. We sort of had a feeling this guy could play, but Rosenia was probably just, we're just topping up.
Yeah.
But he had a real impact straight away. Not to mention the fact that he could really play both sides of the park, and he almost probably, he's a real heart warmer, because I think that's when we realised, okay, we are actually structurally trying to rebuild what could be a Premier League side. We just didn't know he was a key part of it, or a good part of it.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of other signings from that period, Harper and Solano. Solano came with a little bit of pedigree as well, so he was probably cut from the same mould as Corrin, but just didn't have the same success. Harper was, as you say, sort of bringing bodies into the building. If anything else, in no disrespect to Harper, but I don't think he had a particularly significant impact at the club. Gerrard was an interesting one. I was sort of at the time a bit disappointed we didn't push to make that permanent at the end of the season, because I think he I could be mistaken. I think he won our Player of the Season that year, or he came close. He had a terrific season for us on loan. I think he was basically a swap for Olofinjana. It was a really weird deal where we loaned Olofinjana to them and they loaned Gerrard to us, but then we agreed that they could play against their parent clubs, which is pretty rare in England. I don't even know if you're still able to do that. But obviously, cousin
didn't Olofinjana score against us too?
Yeah, I think he did. I think he did. So that made it even more bizarre.
Yeah, he did nothing for us.
Yeah, exactly right. And then, of course, we had Bostock, who came in from Spurs. And, I mean, Bostock at that point was almost like I'm trying to think of a modern-day player to compare him to. But he was, that sort of flashy, young, exciting signing on loan from a top Premier League club where you think, especially after that goal on the opening day of the season, you sort of think, geez, we've got one here. And it just, I just can't put my finger on why it didn't work out for him. Maybe it was effort or thinking he was above the station that he was playing at. I'm not sure, but that signing could have been anything. It's just a disappointment the way it petered out.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where that position was at the time. We signed 3 or 4 guys on a free. 2 really worked and 2 really bombed. And I think as well, I remember getting pretty excited with who we were signing, even though some of them were just on loan. But I think it's like most things, the reason why they're not staying with the club they're at is because the clubs they're at don't rate them as highly as maybe others. But I think if I remember, I think you're right. I think Gerrard, if he wasn't player of the year, he was pretty close.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then we did sort of descend into this revolving door of keepers, because for a while we had Matt Duke in goal, which was terrific because he was a great servant of the club and did really well for us. But we did end up bringing in Vito Minoni from Arsenal, and I think that sort of began the revolving door of different goalkeepers, because we had Minoni through the door first, then Guzan and Ben Amos and others like that followed after that. But I guess the only other significant player that came in during this period, who at the time, speaking of Bostock, was Cameron Stewart from United, and he was the first of a few United players that came through the doors. The others came in the next half of the season, so Chester and Brady and guys like that. But Cameron Stewart, when he joined, was the hype machine. He was really exciting to watch. When we did eventually make that permanent, and then Leicester tried to buy him off us and we refused. It was one of those sort of sliding doors moments. But Stewart was a really impressive, tricky winger when he joined, and it kind of gave us that burst of excitement. But he's another one where it just sort of petered off in the end for him.
Yeah, no, I can't help but think that maybe it's got something to do with the way he was managed, because I remember, like you said, he came on, he was one of those Man United pedigree type players that we all knew, okay, if we signed one of those, we should be looking at someone of quality. But he just didn't seem to get far with us at all. And I don't know, I know he got loaned out to Leeds. I think there was another club there as well. He just didn't seem to be able to gel with anyone. And then all of a sudden, he's showing some pure genius at times, and it's almost like it's a different bloke.
Yeah, and I've just had a look, and our memories are correct. It was Gerrard who won Player of the Season, and it was Rossini actually who came second. So backing up exactly what we're saying. So we'll look now at some of the games from that first half of the season, and the picture I've got here is from the opening day with Bostock up against Swansea player. Was probably almost game of the season. In doing that quick check on who won Player of the Season, I also noted that Bostock won Goal of the Season for his effort in this game. So it almost started off because I remember watching this game, and Ashby got the second goal towards the end of the match, and it was such a neat 2-0 win that you just sort of looked at it and went, geez, okay, we're actually we've taken to the championship pretty well, settled in. We've found a player here in Bostock. Team's sort of settled. We've kept a clean sheet. All up from here, and it sort of didn't end up that way. But do you have any games that stand out from that first half of the season in your mind?
I think probably the big ones that probably stuck out for me at the time is obviously knowing that when we went up, Cardiff were always thereabouts. And the fact that they probably, when we were looking at the way that game panned out, that was probably the time to say, okay, for me anyway, I thought, right, this is going to be a lot tougher than we thought. But probably the big one that I really remember the most was when we actually played, I think, if you remember, it would have been just, was that Boxing? No, it wasn't Boxing Day we played Leeds. It was before Christmas, I think. It was a 2-2 against Leeds, but it was obviously, a big game to play away. And I think I always sort of used the Leeds away game as a good yardstick, which, funny enough, if you look at last year, proves the point. But the fact that we could go to Leeds at a time they thought they're okay and promotion rivals and all this sort of stuff, and I think we didn't win, but we actually played quite well to draw, that I thought, okay, we're a chance not to end up as bad as things feel. And then, of course, we played them at home about 2 or 3 months later and got the same result. So it didn't really mean anything in the scheme of things. But I probably felt anyway that I was really worried about us really slipping away that year to the point where, League One was an option. And the fact that we just pinched a couple of games against what I would say is those big rivals, not just because of locality, but because of size. I felt like Pearson was the right man for the job and things were a bit more secure, if you like.
Yeah, and you've got a great memory. It was 2-2. It was in November we played Leeds, and funnily enough, that was Bostock's second and only other goal of the season for us. So an appropriate one to bring up in that context. For me, what stands out from that season, or that first half of the season, the 4-0 with Millwall was the first City game I saw live. So I'd been over in England for the second half of the Premier League campaign, but had missed the chance to get along to games because I was living down in London. So I sort of looked at the schedule, and I was flying back home start of October. So I think the only game in London or around London before then was that Millwall game, and I thought, it's an experience in itself to go along to the Den and watch your side playing Millwall. So I thought I should go along. It was an eye-opening experience in a lot of ways. So, losing 4-0 and still getting coins and bottles and other things thrown at us as we were leaving the ground was certainly an experience. Yeah, exactly. And as I mentioned earlier, it was Corin's debut for us as well. So that was a pretty good game, or a noteworthy game to have been able to go along and see. I think I remember Cullen might have started up top for us, and I think he actually almost looked the best player on the pitch for us at the time. So had a few wraps around Cullen at the time as well. So that's probably the one that stands out for me. And then I think it was also we beat Norwich. Might have been October or November. Actually it was September, where it was our first away win in 30 games, where Corin and Kearney got on the score sheet for that one as well. So it was a pretty memorable game as well to kind of snap that winless streak away from home, which was pretty good. And then, as we said before, talking about Pearson, keeping 9 clean sheets in those first 20 games was a pretty good hallmark of how he managed to turn the side around in a pretty short period of time, to put us back on track. As you say, it could have all kind of fallen out under us, because from memory, maybe after the first month or so of the season, I think we were in the relegation zone, and it was really we were really staring down the barrel of a second relegation. I think, match day 16, looking at it, we were sitting 22nd in the table, and I think that might have been just before the Allams came in. So it was very much a sliding doors moment at the time. And I know people will say what they want about the Allams, and I do agree to a large extent, but I think taking over the club when they did, and not waiting for us to fall into administration, get docked the 9 points or 14 points or whatever it was, probably helped us stay up that season and kick on the way we did. But we will look at the second half of this season when the Allams took over, the players that came in, because of course Fryatt, Chester, Brady, all those sorts of guys came in that second half of the season. But it is, looking at this part of the season in isolation, it is interesting to sort of look at you're starting to see the building blocks of the side that eventually went up under Steve Bruce. So as we were saying, the Liam Rossini and Corin signings in particular, were really the sort of bedrock signings of that side. Even Jay Simpson, who we hadn't mentioned, but Jay Simpson coming in from Arsenal and alongside Fried and Aluko later on for Bruce, did actually play a pretty decent role in that promotion season as well. So we did sort of put the building blocks in place. It wasn't as if we brought in a whole bunch of short-term players who then were straight back out the door. We did start to make that transition.
Yeah, and I think probably that sums it up really well, just as far as that role that we got on. I think I just remember that Leeds game and talking to my old man saying, "Oh, I've got a bad feeling about this." And
Yeah.
that would have been, I can't remember how far back we're going exactly, but it would have been around the time that we thought, if I remember, Bullard was, he was around and causing pain because we knew it was pretty public how much he was getting paid and not seeming to care. But I remember thinking, and I don't know, you might be able to check through your archives, mate. I don't know if Fryatt played in the first Leeds game, but he definitely played in the second one.
No, because Fryatt only joined in January, I think.
Oh, right, okay. So
Yeah,
I remember,
yeah.
even though it was at home and it was the same result, I remember thinking that, okay, the first game against Leeds away, great, we picked up a point. That was good. But I was still worried about where our goals were going to come from. And I think in the second half of that season is where Kyron clearly started just banging him in for fun. But having Fryatt join was like, oh, this guy's just a known freak of a goal scorer at Leicester. And you knew he was going to be good for us.
Yeah, and looking at that score sheet, I mean, we're skipping ahead a little bit here, probably touch on it again in the next episode, but looking ahead at that score sheet, so Fried and Chester had opened the scoring for us in that Leeds game, and funnily enough, it was Snodgrass who pulled the first back for Leeds before they got it back to 2-2. So there's a few familiar names that are floating around that championship season for us, so that'll be an interesting one to look forward to as well. The other one was we also had Nicky Barmby, who is still in the side, and I guess there'll be more significance to talk about Barmby the following season when he ended up taking over the reins from Pearson, but he was still contributing a few goals. I mean, you're talking there about sort of the worry about where our goals were going to come from, and quite rightly, because Barmby at the age that he was essentially our leading attacking option at that time, really. And I think in that first half of the season, he was our leading goal scorer with, I think I've got this written down. No, so it was five. I think it was Corrin who had 5 for the first half of the season, but Barmby had also chipped in with, I think, 2 or 3 goals as well. So it was still a capable option for us at the time.
Oh, mate, he was. I remember, you're watching. Sometimes it was just highlights, but I remember watching him as a small bloke. The positions he used to get himself into, for crosses and all that, and the way he scored these goals. I mean, the guy he actually went up a lot further in my book than even those previous years of being a Premier League English superstar. Because there was nights where we were horrible, and someone would just whip a ball in, and the way he would just, at angle, score from in front, behind defenders for such a, well, I say small man, he's not tiny, but he's not huge. But he actually went up more in my book in those, that sort of, I can't remember which part of that season it was, but definitely when he was scoring those goals and we weren't tracking greatly.
He was almost
probably
like a super
showed
sub
more
for us.
than he was. I've got no doubt the way he played in that season is the reason why they automatically made him manager.
Yeah. And in a way, it was a shame. I mean, and again, we are sort of jumping ahead again, but that second season under Pearson, which I think is probably the one that you're referring to even more so, where he did just keep kind of bailing us out. It was a real shame in a way that he refused to play himself, which I guess in a sense is quite noble, but he legitimately would have been a very good option to have been able to throw on late. But he essentially hung up the boots when he became caretaker manager. Yeah,
I agree, mate. He probably didn't really understand, maybe even as he was hitting his prime years or whatever it is, he was definitely still giving us something that was causing a problem.
I just knocked over my mic. Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. But we'll talk more about that season, obviously, on the next couple of episodes. But I think that's a good place to wrap this one up. So thank you for joining me for the first look back at this this decade. We'll see. We'll see how we're going. Whether we keep doing sort of half seasons or whether we switch to doing full seasons, because there's of course the fact that as we get closer to the current day, there'll be a lot more pieces to pull out. So doing these half seasons might be even more relevant as we progress through. But good start, and thank you for joining me, Brad.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks everyone for listening in. We'll probably try and aim to do these every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how we go. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Drop a comment with your favourite memories from this section of the season. Share it around. We'll probably put up a poll potentially about who our best signing was from this first half of the season, or maybe favorite game or favorite memory from this part of the season as well. So we'll look out for a poll, just for a bit of interactive experience with this. But until next time, come on, City.